In the year 1989, the World Wrestling Federation presented itself as an absolutely dominant and unstoppable force in entertainment. The spectacle of WrestleMania V captivated audiences, pulling in nearly 770,000 pay-per-view purchases. Hulk Hogan triumphantly took back his championship title from the formidable Randy Savage, and from a business perspective, the organization appeared to be minting an endless supply of cash. For anyone observing from the outside, it seemed as though Hulkamania had reached its ultimate and most glorious zenith. However, just under that gleaming facade, 1989 marked the period when the entire foundation started to show significant signs of stress. It was a time when incredibly skilled wrestlers found their careers stifled by embarrassing and nonsensical gimmicks. This was the very year that a catastrophic venture into Hollywood filmmaking threatened to completely demolish the company's hard-won credibility with its audience. Furthermore, this was the year that the foundational elements of numerous scandals, which would later erupt in the early 1990s, were quietly taking root just out of public view. This is the definitive account of every major misstep and internal crisis that plagued the World Wrestling Federation in 1989, a pivotal year that laid bare the critical vulnerabilities concealed within Vince McMahon's growing empire. The year kicked off with a creative decision so completely bewildering that it continues to puzzle wrestling analysts even several decades later. On the 15th of January, 1989, in Houston, Texas, the colossal Big John Studd emerged victorious in the second ever Royal Rumble event. This particular event was monumental, as it was the first Royal Rumble to be broadcast on pay-per-view, and the first to expand its roster to 30 competitors. Studd secured his victory by tossing the $1 Million Man over the top rope. Yet the strange thing was that this monumental win led to absolutely nothing for him. He was conspicuously absent from the title picture and was never granted a championship opportunity at WrestleMania V. On the contrary, this celebrated Royal Rumble champion was demoted to the role of a special guest referee for the contest between Jake the Snake Roberts and Andre the Giant. It was a position that made no logical sense whatsoever, especially considering that a Royal Rumble victory was promoted as a career-defining achievement. The promise of the entire match's stipulation was completely squandered on a performer for whom the company had no significant long-term creative vision. This booking choice appeared even more pointless when Studd departed from the World Wrestling Federation by the summer of 1989, citing mounting injuries. A variety of reports from that time documented that he participated in a series of lackluster matches against Andre, Akeem, and Haku at live events throughout that year. His body was clearly failing him, and he was in no physical condition to be winning the promotion's second most important signature match. The issues on the Royal Rumble 1989 undercard were just as glaring and problematic. The Women's Championship bout pitting Rockin' Robin against Judy Martin was roundly condemned as dreadfully dull, performed in front of a silent and disengaged audience. The match between King Haku and Harley Race was similarly critiqued as quite poor and a plodding, uninteresting affair. A 2 out of 3 falls contest that involved Jim Duggan and the Hart Foundation was dismissed as utterly predictable and more suitable for a non-televised local show than a premium pay-per-view event. The single truly significant development from the event was the planting of the seeds for the eventual collapse of the Mega Powers. In a pivotal moment, Hogan inadvertently caused Savage's elimination while he was attempting to remove Bad News Brown, leading to a palpable, tense standoff that not even the calming presence of Miss Elizabeth could diffuse. This simmering storyline of envy and distrust was being carefully orchestrated to culminate at WrestleMania. However, the long-term consequences of that particular storyline on Randy Savage's career would prove to be an entirely separate and significant problem. WrestleMania V, held on April 2, 1989, inside the Atlantic City Convention Hall, is chiefly remembered for its main event, billed as the Mega Powers Explode. In that contest, Hulk Hogan vanquished Randy Savage to capture the championship, in a match that many reviewers lauded as one of the finest of 1989. The narrative driving this confrontation had been meticulously crafted for more than a full year leading up to the event. While the in-ring conclusion was satisfying, almost every other component of the grand spectacle proved to be a critical failure. The showdown between Jake Roberts and Andre the Giant is widely regarded as one of the absolute worst matches in WrestleMania's long history, as Andre's severe physical deterioration had become impossible to ignore. He could hardly maneuver around the ring. The inclusion of Big John Studd as a special referee added no value and was thematically incoherent, given that he was supposed to be a Royal Rumble champion with his own title ambitions. Pundits at the time labeled it as excruciatingly terrible and unwatchable. A match that seemed to exist only to find a spot for the legendary Andre on the card. The clash between Brutus the Barber Beefcake and the $1 Million Man dragged on for a monotonous 10-minute stretch before concluding unsatisfyingly in a double countout. This provided absolutely no sense of closure for the fans who had become emotionally invested in their feud. The $1 Million Man was one of the promotion's most effective villains, and was certainly deserving of something better than an indecisive and weak finish. The handicap match, featuring Demolition against the Powers of Pain, was significantly hindered by the active participation of Mr. Fuji as a competitor, who was primarily a manager. He simply was not equipped to be wrestling for any significant length of time, while a separate segment with Brother Love and Roddy Piper was painfully long and ultimately foolish. Television personality Morton Downey Jr. also made a celebrity cameo that served no purpose and led to nothing of consequence. Even a much-hyped musical performance by Run DMC fell completely flat because the acoustics within the arena were so dreadful that the live audience struggled to hear the music. The entire broadcast gave off the impression of being haphazardly assembled, which was shocking for what was supposed to be the company's flagship event of the year. Reviews from that period characterized the event as feeling like it was produced with a very limited budget, with a profound and obvious absence of the major celebrity involvement seen in prior WrestleManias. The choice of venue was the exact same Atlantic City Convention Hall that had been used for WrestleMania IV just 1 year before. This decision established the first and only instance of WrestleMania returning to the very same location in 2 consecutive years. It strongly suggested that the company was simply riding the wave of its past success, instead of innovating and striving to create something even grander. But the most devastating issue was the catastrophic effect the main event's outcome had on Randy Savage's career. His value as a top-tier star was profoundly diminished by this entire storyline. For the next couple of years, he was simply lost in the shuffle, just another face on the expansive roster. After surrendering the championship to Hogan, Savage was abruptly pushed out of the world title picture entirely, and was instead relegated to participating in the bizarre Zeus angle. It was a creative decision that critics universally panned as completely nonsensical, a move that effectively torpedoed the Macho Man's career as a main event draw. Just pause and consider that for a second. We're talking about Randy Savage, a man widely considered to be among the most phenomenal performers in the entire history of wrestling. His reign as champion had been truly outstanding. His matches were, without fail, the most exciting and well-executed bouts on every single card. And the company's reward for all his hard work and excellence was to have him lose to Hogan and then immediately throw him into a feud with an actor from a failed movie who wasn't even a trained wrestler. The Mega Powers storyline was ultimately designed to make Hulk Hogan seem like the superior star. In contrast, it portrayed Savage as an unhinged, jealous figure who was completely ruled by his emotions. And once Savage suffered that crucial main event defeat, he never managed to fully reclaim his top spot within the company. He would not hold the World Championship again until 1992. Even then, his reign was incredibly brief, lasting only a few days before he was booked to lose it again. Any serious discussion about the company's problems in 1989 must include the creative blunders that humiliated incredibly talented wrestlers with preposterous gimmicks. The saga of the Red Rooster emerged as the year's most notoriously bad example. Terry Taylor had already established himself as a highly respected and technically proficient wrestler in the NWA, WCCW, and UWF territories. He was a popular fan favorite, with great looks and undeniable in-ring talent. When he joined the company in 1988, he was rebranded as the Red Rooster and put under the management of Bobby Heenan. The entire story was that Taylor was an unskilled novice whose success was meant to demonstrate that Heenan's managerial skills could guide anyone to championship gold. When the character turned into a good guy after Heenan slapped Taylor on the January 9, 1989 broadcast of Saturday Night's Main Event, the level of embarrassment was ratcheted up considerably. Taylor was made to sport hair dyed bright red and styled into a mohawk that resembled a rooster's comb. He would perform a rooster-like strut on his way to the ring. He would crow at the audience. He would bob his head around as if he were a chicken pecking for seeds. His appearance at WrestleMania V amounted to a 30-second squash match victory over Bobby Heenan himself. The win was so utterly meaningless that it actually served to diminish his standing even more. By the time SummerSlam 1989 came around, he was losing decisively to Mr. Perfect in another very short match. At the 1990 Royal Rumble, he was eliminated by Andre the Giant in just under 2 minutes. The Red Rooster character was a career death sentence from which Taylor never truly recovered. Most fans will forever associate him with that one ludicrous character. Taylor left the company in June of 1990 and was never able to recapture the status he had before his arrival. He had been a completely legitimate main event level star in the regional territories. The company managed to turn him into an absolute joke. The most disturbing part is that some sources claim this gimmick was first pitched for Curt Hennig before they came up with the Mr. Perfect persona. Perfect instead. It's astonishing to think the company was close to destroying 2 major careers with the exact same terrible concept. Dusty Rhodes was subjected to treatment that was arguably even more degrading than what Terry Taylor went through. The 3-time NWA World Champion and one of the sport's most iconic performers made his debut on May 29, 1989, wearing a black singlet adorned with large, bright yellow polka dots. Promotional videos showed him performing blue-collar jobs, portraying him as a plumber, a worker at a gas station, and even a man cooking tacos. The consensus among many was that this was a deliberate and petty act of revenge by Vince McMahon against a former major business rival. The character Virgil, who acted as the bodyguard for the $1 Million Man, had already been named after Dusty's real first name as a pointed inside joke. Now, Rhodes himself was being compelled to prance around in polka dots, essentially being presented as a circus clown for the audience's amusement. The legendary commentator Jim Ross has stated his belief that the polka dots were a calculated effort to humiliate him. Teddy Long provided a different take on the situation, acknowledging that while Vince made him wear the polka dots, Dusty's immense charisma allowed him to overcome the ridiculous attire. Dusty was the kind of performer who could make any character popular, no matter what you threw at him. However, that remarkable talent does not excuse the demeaning treatment he received. Dusty's son, Cody Rhodes, has been very public about his deep dissatisfaction with his father's time in the company. We're discussing a man who had been one of the biggest attractions in the annals of wrestling. This was a man who had sold out arenas all over the nation. A man whose promo skills are still analyzed by wrestlers learning the craft today. And the company decided the best use for this legend was to put him in polka dots and have him dance in the ring with his manager, Sapphire. Barry Windham's Widowmaker gimmick was yet another victim of the company's period of creative stagnation. The former NWA United States champion was widely seen as one of the most gifted performers of his time. He was a former member of the Four Horsemen. He had wrestled in main events against the great Ric Flair. He was an authentic, top-level superstar. Wyndham came back to the promotion in June of 1989, repackaged as a vaguely defined heel cowboy named the Widowmaker. He remained undefeated for a stretch of 4 months, but was never placed in any feuds of consequence or given any significant storylines. Nobody seemed to have a clear creative direction for him. By October of 1989, he was gone from the company entirely. As one pundit famously quipped, "If you took a bathroom break, you likely missed his whole tenure as the Widowmaker." The company had one of the planet's best wrestlers under contract and completely misused his immense talent. Throughout the year of 1989, Hulk Hogan held a powerful grip on the company's creative process, a level of influence that many critics believe negatively impacted the entire locker room. Hogan even admitted to participating in backstage politics to maintain his top spot. During an interview he gave to the Orlando Sentinel, Hogan acknowledged that to stay at the pinnacle, he was forced to engage in political maneuvering to secure his spot. He pointed out that while everyone says, "Well, Hulk Hogan was a politician," his own reply was, "And thank God he was." He credited this political skill as the very reason he earned more money and held the championship longer than anyone else in the business. Perhaps the most telling incident actually occurred before 1989, but it perfectly showcases Hogan's methods. Leading up to WrestleMania II in 1986, Jesse Ventura tried to get the company's wrestlers to form a union. Hogan then went directly to Vince McMahon and informed him of the unionization effort. This fact came to light during a sworn deposition for a lawsuit, where McMahon testified under oath that Hulk Hogan was indeed his informant. When Ventura eventually learned of this betrayal, his reaction was one of complete devastation. He described the feeling as being just like getting punched squarely in the face. This was a man he considered a friend, and he felt that Hogan had completely betrayed their trust. Ventura clarified that for anyone who came up in the business during the old territory days, the most detestable accusation you could face was being called an office stooge. That term describes someone who travels with all the other wrestlers, making them believe he's one of them. But secretly, the entire time, he's soaking up all the backstage gossip and reporting everything directly to the promoters. The famous Mega Powers storyline was fueled by legitimate real-world animosity brewing behind the scenes. According to several accounts, Randy Savage placed the blame for serious problems in his personal life squarely on Hulk Hogan. In fact, both Brutus Beefcake and Jimmy Hart have confirmed that Savage physically struck Hogan with a punch backstage at WrestleMania IX. The intense personal conflict is said to have originated during their 1989 storyline collaboration. Bret Hart's critique of Hogan's legacy was particularly harsh. Hart expressed that when he reflects on his own career and the wrestling industry as a whole, Hulk Hogan did absolutely nothing to help create new stars. He never offered a helping hand to anyone else after his own time as the main attraction was over. Bret felt Hogan would sooner watch the company fail than return to help build the next top superstar. By the latter part of 1989, Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior had effectively run through and defeated every major villain on the roster. Randy Savage, Ted DiBiase, the Big Boss Man, Akeem, Bad News Brown, the legendary Andre the Giant, and Haku, alongside Rick Rude, Dino Bravo, and even the character Zeus, had all been systematically made to look like second-rate losers on multiple occasions. The roster's overall depth was being systematically sacrificed simply to protect two top fan favorites who flat-out refused to let anyone else get a victory over them. The Ultimate Warrior's massive push in 1989 brought to light some severe, fundamental flaws in the company's creative approach. His shortcomings as an in-ring performer were substantial. His repertoire of moves was incredibly limited, consisting of just punches, clotheslines, shoulder tackles, a gorilla press slam, and his running splash finisher. He demonstrated no understanding of match psychology. His timing was consistently poor. He was simply not reliable enough to be trusted with calling and leading a match in the ring. The legendary Jim Ross made a very unflattering comparison between the Warrior and his contemporary, Sting. Ross believed that Warrior's popularity was based almost entirely on aesthetics, like his vibrant attire and face paint, whereas Sting had a genuine passion for learning the craft. Sting was known for being patient, respectful, and having time for everyone. The Warrior, on the other hand, possessed none of those admirable traits. Ross stated that Jim Crockett Promotions unquestionably got the superior bargain with Sting. JBL's assessment of the Warrior was even more scathing. He labeled Warrior an unadulterated piece of garbage who wouldn't be able to survive in the modern era, claiming he was constantly surrounded by immense talent that masked his own profound inability to actually wrestle. The Warrior was also widely known for being dangerously stiff and reckless with his opponents in the ring. Rick Rude, who is often credited with carrying Warrior to his most acclaimed matches at WrestleMania V and SummerSlam 1989, reportedly took Warrior aside to confront him about his unsafe style. According to the stories that circulated, a fight broke out between them, which Rude decisively won. The iconic Andre the Giant had a remarkably similar experience. Warrior was working far too stiffly with Andre, and when the Giant warned him to take it easy, Warrior casually dismissed the advice and kept up his reckless pace. This continued until Andre had enough and knocked him completely senseless with a single punch to the head. After taking that devastating punch from Andre, the Ultimate Warrior became noticeably more careful and considerate in the ring. Bobby Heenan personally and explicitly warned Warrior not to perform a clothesline on him due to a severe neck injury. In a brazen act of defiance, Warrior did the one thing Heenan begged him not to do, hitting the manager with a clothesline from behind. This careless move greatly magnified the risk to Heenan's already fragile neck. Heenan carried a deep resentment for Warrior, flatly stating that he was not a professional wrestler. He insisted that Warrior got into the business purely because he viewed it as an easy payday. Jake Roberts, however, shared the most condemning story of all. Roberts recalled going to Warrior's private dressing room, which Warrior had demanded be separate from all the other wrestlers on the roster. Warrior's initial words to Roberts were to declare that he cared nothing about Roberts' family and cared nothing about Roberts as a person. He continued by saying he didn't care about wrestling at all. He was just there to do his routine. He then sternly warned Roberts to never miss a show, because that would mean messing with the Warrior's income. Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine officially designated the feud between the Warrior and Andre the Giant as the worst feud of the year for 1989. This served as a powerful indictment of how negatively Warrior's incredibly one-sided squash matches were being perceived, even by the most casual wrestling fans. The storyline featuring Zeus stands as one of the company's most profoundly embarrassing creative missteps of that entire decade. The company pushed a completely untrained actor into its main event scene for the sole reason that he appeared in Hulk Hogan's unsuccessful movie. That film, No Holds Barred, was released on June 2, 1989, with an $8 million budget. The critical reception for the movie was absolutely vicious. On the review site Rotten Tomatoes, it holds an approval rating of just 10%. Both Siskel and Ebert gave it a thumbs down, and they also included it in their compilations of the worst films of 1989. Gene Siskel wrote that No Holds Barred is completely missing the enjoyable, campy quality that made the televised wrestling programs so popular. The Washington Post was even more direct, calling the film charmless, stupid, and terribly made. A critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer savagely wrote that observing Hogan's performance was to see the art of acting get trapped in a half Nelson and then gleefully suffocated. The movie launched at the number 2 position, right behind Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, earning just shy of $5 million. Its total gross reached a disappointing $16 million, which was barely twice what it cost to make. After accounting for distribution expenses, Vince McMahon essentially just broke even on the project. The picture survived in theaters for a paltry 4 weeks. The story of how the script came to be is truly legendary. When the first draft was submitted, both Hogan and McMahon rejected it, prompting them to seclude themselves in a Florida hotel. For 72 consecutive hours, they worked tirelessly, rewriting the entire screenplay from the ground up as a team. In his autobiography, Hogan claimed he suffered from writer's block while trying to figure out the climax. So he sat on the toilet, dozed off, and envisioned the perfect final battle in a dream. He then, supposedly, bolted from the bathroom and dictated the entire sequence to Vince while keeping his eyes closed to hold on to the vision. Years later, in 1997, Vince McMahon openly mocked the film's failure during an episode of Monday Night Raw. He revealed that Hogan had promised to return his salary if the movie ended up losing money, with Vince sarcastically suggesting the check must still be lost in the mail. The most significant issue, however, was integrating the character of Zeus into actual wrestling narratives. The actor who played him, Tiny Lister, had absolutely no professional wrestling training. His entire skill set consisted of just 2 moves, the bear hug and a choking maneuver. That was the full extent of his in-ring repertoire. The $1 Million Man later reflected on the backstage atmosphere on his podcast. He recalled being certain that quite a few of the other wrestlers were not thrilled about the situation at all. He even suspected that Hogan himself wasn't particularly enthusiastic about it. Vince, however, was convinced he could turn anyone into a major star. They extracted what little they could from Lister, but it was far from enough. There was very little raw talent for them to shape. At the main event of SummerSlam 1989, the situation escalated and became genuinely hazardous. As Brutus Beefcake recounted, Zeus had a tendency to become overly aggressive in the heat of the match, leading Hogan and Beefcake to devise a strange method for calming him down. They would continuously mutter the phrase, "Free James Brown," to Zeus, a reference to the singer's recent incarceration. For whatever reason, this seemed to entertain Zeus and had a noticeable pacifying effect on him during the match. In spite of all these behind-the-scenes problems, SummerSlam 1989 managed to attract 625,000 pay-per-view buys, which at the time was the second highest number ever recorded. This immense success led Vince to believe that Zeus was a certified moneymaker. Persistent rumors have circulated for years that the original plan was for a Hogan vs. Zeus showdown to be the headline match for WrestleMania VI. Fortunately for everyone involved, more rational minds ultimately won out. In the end, Zeus's record in the company was 0 wins and 5 losses. He never secured a single victory. Despite being portrayed as an invincible force of nature, every single one of his appearances concluded with him being thoroughly defeated by Hogan. The booking decisions were completely illogical. If Zeus was meant to be a credible menace, why was he constantly losing? And if he wasn't a credible menace, what was he doing in the main event spotlight? His final appearance was tied to the desperate, no-holds-barred, The Match, the movie pay-per-view on December 27, 1989. This was a peculiar event that first broadcast the entire movie, followed by a steel cage match that had been pre-taped on December 12th in Nashville. The whole idea was bizarre. Audiences were asked to pay for a movie they could easily rent from any video store, immediately followed by a wrestling match starring a man who was famously incapable of wrestling. To this day, the event stands as one of the very few WWE pay-per-views that is still absent from the WWE network. The entire Zeus fiasco was a perfect example of everything that had gone wrong with the company's creative strategy in 1989. They consistently prioritized flashy spectacle over meaningful substance. They elevated sheer muscle mass above genuine in-ring skill. The company operated under the flawed assumption that star power imported from outside the wrestling world could ever be a proper replacement for authentic wrestling talent. The saga of Zeus demonstrated unequivocally that this formula had profound and serious limitations. Beyond the drama in the main event, SummerSlam 1989 also suffered a notable production mistake that was broadcast to a national audience. During a pre-recorded interview segment with Rick Rude and Bobby Heenan, the large SummerSlam logo dramatically fell right off the wall behind them. An audibly frustrated Mean Gene Okerlund shouted an expletive, demanding to know who had hung the sign and questioning if this was what $200 an hour work looked like. The production team mistakenly aired the outtake, the blooper-filled version, instead of the intended clean take of the interview. Vince McMahon allegedly got on the commentators' headsets and instructed them to improvise a cover. Jesse Ventura quickly smoothed it over by calling Mean Gene a habitual troublemaker. Even more consequentially, SummerSlam 1989 almost resulted in the company losing Bret Hart. The Hart Foundation was defeated by the Brainbusters in a non-title bout, even though the Busters held the Tag Team Championship belts. Earlier on that very day, the Harts and Vince McMahon engaged in what Bret Hart would later describe as a lengthy and very tense debate about the match's planned outcome. McMahon stubbornly refused to alter his decision. Both Bret and the Anvil were so frustrated that they departed the arena before the event had even concluded. Bret later confessed that he was dealing with significant financial struggles at that point in his career. The expense of paying for his own air travel was becoming an enormous burden. Brian Pillman supplied Bret with Ric Flair's phone number, and Bret subsequently reached out to WCW to discuss the possibility of leaving. It was only after learning that his potential WCW salary would be insignificant compared to his WWE earnings that he ultimately made the choice to remain with the company. WWE came perilously close to losing one of the most legendary wrestlers in its entire history, all due to questionable booking and even more questionable treatment of its performers. The most significant talent departure of 1989 was, without a doubt, the Brainbusters. Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard, both former members of the Four Horsemen, were widely regarded as the pinnacle of technical tag team wrestling during that period. They captured the WWE Tag Team Championship from Demolition on July 18, 1989, concluding Demolition's historic 478-day reign. But their own time as champions was brief, lasting just 3 months before they lost the belts back on October 2, 1989. Their very last WWE appearance occurred on October 31, 1989, during a match against the Rockers, which ended with Bobby Heenan theatrically firing them on live television. The true reason for their departure came to light at Survivor Series. On November 1, 1989, Tully Blanchard failed a company drug test. The test came back positive for cocaine. As a direct result, Bobby Heenan himself was forced to step in as a last-minute replacement for Blanchard on the Survivor Series event card. The moment news of the failed drug test surfaced, WCW's top executive, Jim Herd, immediately yanked Tully Blanchard's contract offer right off the table. In a subsequent move, Herd also dramatically slashed Arn Anderson's proposed contract, cutting it down from a lucrative $250,000 a year to a mere $150,000. Herd's justification was cold and simple. As individual performers, they just didn't command the same value. The fallout was so severe that, as the story goes, Anderson and Blanchard wouldn't speak to each other for an entire decade following the whole ordeal. Ironically, despite their fleeting tenure in the WWE, the Brainbusters were honored as Pro Wrestling Illustrated's prestigious Tag Team of the Year. This award was a clear recognition of their incredible matches, which many wrestling historians still regard as some of the absolute greatest of that entire era. Their series of matches against the Rockers was nothing short of legendary, which makes it all the more baffling that the WWE somehow allowed this phenomenal talent to just slip through their fingers. By 1989, the WWE's once promising women's division had all but vanished into thin air. Rockin' Robin was the reigning WWE Women's Champion, having captured the title from the formidable Sensational Sherry in Paris on October 8, 1988. However, her championship defense at the 1989 Royal Rumble against Judy Martin was met with complete indifference from a silent, unresponsive audience. The final time Robin would ever defend her title took place on June 25, 1989, in Wheeling, West Virginia. Once again, facing Judy Martin. She parted ways with the company in early 1990, and with no active champion, the Women's Championship itself was officially deactivated on February 21, 1990, due to a lack of activity. This followed the deactivation of the WWE Women's Tag Team Championship, which had already been shelved in February 1989. Leaving the Glamour Girls as the division's final champions. The way Sensational Sherry was handled truly epitomized this tragic waste of talent. She was an acclaimed three-time AWA Women's Champion who possessed exceptional technical skill, compelling character work, and masterful promo abilities. Moreover, Sherry had an unparalleled toughness, able to absorb punishment in the ring in a way that no other woman of her time possibly could. But instead of building an entire division around this incredible athlete, WWE inexplicably repackaged her as Randy Savage's manager, a change that began at WrestleMania V. Under the new persona of Sensational Queen Sherry, she spent the entirety of 1989 relegated to screaming at ringside instead of actually competing inside the ring. The indignity peaked at SummerSlam 1989, where Brutus Beefcake publicly cut her hair following the main event. A genuinely talented performer had been reduced to nothing more than a storyline prop. Consequently, the entire women's division lay dormant for years, not seeing a revival until 1993 with the arrival of Alundra Blaze. Despite never capturing the WWE Championship after his tournament finals loss to Randy Savage at WrestleMania IV, the $1 Million Man solidified his status as one of wrestling's most iconic villains throughout 1989. Since he couldn't win the company's top prize, Ted DiBiase was simply given his very own title, the $1 Million Championship. This custom belt was famously unveiled on the Brother Love Show on March 4, 1989, and was rumored to have cost somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 to create. The ingenious creative logic behind this move came from the legendary Pat Patterson, who posed a question to Ted. What if you don't win the world title? Which is precisely what the audience expects to happen. Patterson then brilliantly pitched the idea of circumventing the system entirely by creating a brand new championship exclusively for Ted. DiBiase immediately understood and accepted this line of thinking, later stating that connecting with the audience and getting over as a character was far more important to him than holding any particular title belt. For the rest of 1989, Ted engaged in a heated feud with Jake Roberts and even formed an alliance with the monstrous Zeus for Survivor Series. Yet he was never granted a decisive world title victory, despite being widely considered the perfect heel to represent the company as its champion. Meanwhile, the former AWA World Heavyweight Champion, Curt Hennig, was introduced as Mr. Perfect and embarked on an incredible undefeated streak on WWE television that lasted for more than a full year. All through 1989, he systematically defeated a who's who of mid-card talent, including names like Brian Blair, Ronnie Garvin, Coco Beware, the Blue Blazer, the Red Rooster, Jimmy Snuka, Tito Santana, and even a young Bret Hart. That impressive undefeated streak finally came to a dramatic end on December 13, 1989, when he suffered his first televised loss at the hands of the immortal Hulk Hogan. Even though Lanny Poffo famously called him the very best worker I ever touched, Hennig was consistently booked at the mid-card level during 1989. In fact, he wouldn't capture the Intercontinental Championship until May of 1990. Even Hulk Hogan himself lavished praise on Hennig, once stating, "Everybody would check their egos at the door when they came to a building that Curt Hennig was in. You simply couldn't outwork him. You couldn't outshine him. You couldn't outperform him." And yet, Despite this universal acclaim from his peers, the WWE stubbornly refused to elevate him beyond the confines of the mid-card. Ravishing Rick Rude achieved a major victory by defeating the Ultimate Warrior for the Intercontinental Championship at WrestleMania V, only to lose it back to him at SummerSlam 1989, thanks to some critical interference from Rowdy Roddy Piper. This ignited a bitter rivalry, and Rude spent the remainder of 1989 locked in a fierce feud with Piper, which culminated in them brawling to a double countout at Survivor Series. According to numerous wrestling historians, Rude was unequivocally the best villain the WWE had on its roster in the late 1980s. But it's reported he received only a single world title opportunity against Hogan, which he lost. Allegations persist that Hogan himself refused to work with Rude, citing the latter's reputation for having a volatile temper. Speaking of misused talent, Owen Hart made his WWE debut in 1988 as the masked Blue Blazer, a superhero persona that ultimately failed to connect with audiences. In a curious move, the WWE decided to place him under a mask rather than capitalizing on his lineage by promoting him as the younger brother of Bret Hart. His entire 1989 run largely consisted of televised losses to established stars like the $1 Million Man and Mr. Perfect. Frustrated with his role, Owen departed from the WWE after WrestleMania V to go tour the world and hone his craft in Stampede Wrestling. He wouldn't make his return until 1991, this time performing under his real name. It was a clear admission that the WWE had squandered a gifted second-generation wrestler by hiding him under a mask and having him consistently lose. The Survivor Series event held on November 23, 1989 at the Rosemont Horizon in Chicago was, by all accounts, an event plagued by a multitude of problems. One of the most noticeable issues was the WWE's sudden decision to alter the event's signature format from 5-on-5 to 4-on-4 elimination teams. This bizarre change completely undermined the event's tagline, "Teams of 5 strive to survive," and no new slogan was created to replace it. The entire format shift felt completely arbitrary and utterly pointless. In the aftermath, the show was widely criticized for being an essentially meaningless pay-per-view that did nothing to advance any ongoing feuds or storylines. Absolutely nothing of consequence was settled, and not a single major storyline was given anything close to a satisfying conclusion. To make matters worse, the two main event matches were singled out as being the biggest culprits in dragging the quality of the entire show down. Critics heavily condemned the Hulkamaniacs versus the $1 Million Team match, citing that the 3 disqualification eliminations were entirely excessive. That contest, which lasted nearly 30 minutes, was widely considered one of the most tedious matches of its length. The audience became visibly agitated as wrestler after wrestler was eliminated through countouts or disqualifications instead of a definitive pinfall. The Ultimate Warriors versus the Heenan family match was plagued by very similar issues, much to the dismay of the fans in attendance. The outcome was utterly predictable from the moment the opening bell rang. It was common knowledge that the Warrior would completely dominate the opposition, which rendered the entire match devoid of any real suspense. Behind the curtain, the entire roster was in a state of chaos. Tully Blanchard had been unceremoniously fired for failing a drug screening just a few weeks prior to the major show. In an unexpected turn, Bobby Heenan himself was required to step in and replace Blanchard as an active competitor on the Survivor Series event card. This put a manager in the unbelievable position of having to wrestle due to a last-minute roster emergency. For Arn Anderson, it was his final match with the company before making his celebrated return to WCW. This event effectively marked the end of the legendary Brainbusters. To make matters worse, Akeem had been sidelined with an injury in the weeks leading up to the event. Bad News Brown was brought in as a late substitute, a move that necessitated Vince McMahon personally re-recording Brown's name in the introduction audio during post-production. The makeshift, patched-together nature of the entire event was glaringly obvious to anyone who was paying close attention, and the predictability factor was absolutely crushing to the experience. Everyone in the building and at home knew with certainty that both Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior would thoroughly dominate their respective encounters. Reviewers expressed their resentment for the change in format, declaring that it resulted in an incredibly predictable show. By the time the night concluded, it felt as though nothing of consequence had changed from before the event started. The ratings for Saturday night's main event told the undeniable story of the promotion's gradual erosion in popularity among viewers. The program reached its absolute peak with an 11.66 rating in March of 1987, which, at the time, was the highest late-night rating ever recorded by NBC. The main event special, featuring the Hogan vs. Andre rematch in February 1988, attracted a monumental 15.2 rating, with an incredible 26.64 million viewers tuning in. Those were truly massive mainstream numbers that elevated wrestling to the level of appointment television. However, by November 1989, Saturday night's main event had seen its viewership fall to an 8.7 rating. That represents a truly significant drop from its previous heights. The trajectory of the show's popularity was clearly pointing downward in a concerning way. This was more than just a natural decline in interest. According to industry analyst Dave Meltzer, the ratings erosion was a specific indicator that the casual, mainstream fans were tuning out, not the core wrestling fan base. The novelty factor that had driven its initial success had completely vanished. Even the immense drawing power of Hulk Hogan was noticeably on the decline. The product itself had become incredibly stale, filled with repetitive and uninspired matchups. How many more times could audiences possibly be expected to watch Hogan overcome the odds against yet another monster heel? The well-worn formula was beginning to wear exceedingly thin with the audience, and NBC executives noticed the steady decline and began to respond accordingly. In 1990, they scaled back their commitment from 6 to only 4 Saturday night broadcasts for the entire year. The episode that aired in November of 1990 was trimmed from its usual 90 minutes down to just 60 minutes. It was clear the network was losing its faith in professional wrestling as a reliable ratings draw. The final NBC airing of Saturday night's main event took place on April 15, 1991, garnering a meager 7.7 rating. NBC decided to drop the promotion entirely after the incredibly controversial Sergeant Slaughter Iraqi sympathizer storyline caused ratings to plummet further and created a public relations nightmare. The pivotal partnership that had defined the company's breakthrough into the mainstream was officially coming to an end. It was ending because the creative product could no longer sustain the enormous audience it had once built. Meanwhile, the stark creative deficiencies of the company were made even more apparent by the high quality of its competition, the NWA. While one promotion was busy running brief squash matches on its syndicated television programs, the NWA was consistently producing matches of historic quality all through 1989. There was the incredible Ric Flair vs. Ricky Steamboat match at Chi-Town Rumble in February, a true classic for the ages. Then came Flair vs. Steamboat at Clash of the Champions in April, followed by another epic encounter between Flair and Steamboat at Wrestle War in May. These 3 legendary matches are still widely considered to be among the greatest in the entire history of professional wrestling. They told compelling, dramatic stories inside the ring through world-class athletic competition and brilliant psychology. The Clash of the Champions, broadcast on April 2, 1989, earned a strong 4.3 TBS cable rating while running in direct opposition to WrestleMania V. The NWA made the bold move to deliberately counter-program its rival's biggest show of the year, and the massive gap in quality was immediately obvious to everyone watching. Contemporary criticism noted that the Clash show was about 50 times better than WrestleMania V in terms of pure match quality. While one company was presenting audiences with an Andre the Giant who was barely mobile, and a performer named Zeus who could not wrestle whatsoever, the NWA was busy delivering five-star classics, making the philosophical divide between them crystal clear. The NWA's focus was on athletic, traditional pro wrestling that featured lengthy matches and deeply compelling storylines that evolved over time. By contrast, its competitor focused on producing a glitzy spectacle, characterized by short matches and outlandish cartoon-like characters. This cartoonish creative direction, which included gimmicks like the Red Rooster, Akeem the African Dream, the Genius, and the Bushwhackers, was actively alienating wrestling purists who began to turn to the NWA for a higher quality product. The Bushwhackers were a particularly telling example of this shift. While working in the territories, they were known as the fearsome and violent sheepherders. They had a reputation as a brutal, bloodthirsty tag team. The company completely transformed them into a silly comedy act whose routine involved licking fans and marching around like imbeciles. That specific transformation came to represent everything that was considered wrong with the company's creative approach at the time. They would take highly talented performers and systematically turn them into ridiculous jokes. The seeds of the massive controversy that would soon shake professional wrestling to its core in the early 1990s were already firmly planted by 1989. At the very center of this developing situation was Dr. George Zahorian, a Pennsylvania-based urologist who also happened to serve as a state-appointed ringside physician at the company's live events. Starting back in the early 1980s, Dr. Zahorian cultivated close personal relationships with the wrestlers, supplying them with a variety of performance-related substances and other prescription medications. During his testimony several years later, Zahorian would state that almost all of his clients during that specific period were wrestlers from that one promotion. Zahorian became a very familiar and constant presence at television tapings. Through the spring of 1984, the company regularly filmed on consecutive nights in Allentown and Hamburg, Pennsylvania, which created a very consistent and convenient meeting point for him and the wrestlers. It was also quite common for these performers to have packages delivered straight to their personal residences, the venues where they performed, and even to the promotion's corporate headquarters. During that period, fan newsletters would sometimes publish cryptic notes about wrestlers making special trips to Pennsylvania for the purpose of enhancing their physical conditioning. These were subtle clues that would only truly gain significance with the benefit of hindsight. Bret Hart's autobiography, Hitman, offers some of the most direct and revealing first-hand accounts of this situation. In a personal journal entry dated September 8, 1985, Hart detailed the experience of standing in a line outside Dr. Zahorian's room, witnessing a steady stream of his colleagues exiting with grocery bags loaded with supplies. Hart made a specific point of noticing that even high-level company executives were among the individuals paying a visit to the doctor. Hart then proceeded to recount his own appointment. His visit involved a very quick examination of his vital signs, which was immediately followed by a simple cash-for-goods exchange, much like the ones he had just seen. Hart explained that it was not at all uncommon for wrestlers to obtain such a large quantity of materials that they were unable to pack it all in their luggage, forcing them to mail it home in separate shipments. Federal investigators would later confirm that Zahorian had supplied substances to more than 40 professional wrestlers, with the overwhelming majority of them being under contract with the organization at the time. The list of individuals identified during the court proceedings included not only some of the most prominent stars of that generation, but also members of the company's senior management. A crucial moment in this saga arrived on the 1st of July, 1989. A new piece of legislation, the Pennsylvania Professional Wrestling Act, which the company ironically supported, actually served to reduce state oversight, and instead required promoters to hire their own ringside medical personnel. This change meant that for the very first time, The promotion would hold direct responsibility for selecting its own medical staff. Anita Scales, who served as Titan Sports Director of Compliance and Regulations, would later state under oath that she adamantly refused to assign Zahorian to events, citing the persistent and troubling rumors that had long followed him. Despite this refusal, Zahorian made numerous attempts to get his old position back. Pat Patterson personally contacted Scales to advocate for him, stressing that Zahorian was the doctor the wrestlers overwhelmingly preferred. Road agent Jay Strongbow made a similar appeal, claiming the talent deeply depended on him. Yet, Scales held her ground and refused. When she elevated the matter to Linda McMahon, her testimony revealed that Linda instructed her to acquiesce to Patterson's request. Subsequently, on December 1, 1989, Linda McMahon sent a confidential memorandum to Pat Patterson. This memo served as a stark warning, indicating that the state of Pennsylvania was very likely preparing to launch an investigation into the illegal distribution of substances within the professional wrestling industry. It was reported that a state official had already informed one of the company's lawyers that investigators had become aware of Zahorian and his specific connection to the promotion. The memorandum ultimately concluded that it was no longer prudent or advisable to continue any professional association with Dr. Zahorian. Vince McMahon was in complete agreement and gave Patterson instructions to notify Zahorian that he was to stop appearing at their events, while also discreetly tipping him off about the looming government investigation. According to the testimony Zahorian gave at his trial, Patterson phoned him and specifically asked if he was speaking from his office before telling him to hang up and call back using a public payphone. Patterson then allegedly instructed Zahorian to locate every piece of information he possessed related to the wrestlers and to immediately destroy all of it. Prosecutor Sean O'Shea drove this point home during his closing argument. He posed the question, "When is the last time you called your own family doctor and asked, 'Where are you calling from?' And if you're at your office, you need to leave and find a payphone to call me back." That is precisely how drug dealers operate. More than any other wrestling organization at the time, this one was a big man's territory, a place where massively muscular physiques were prioritized far above pure wrestling talent. This specific creative preference had a profound effect on the entire company. The in-ring action was often slow-moving and laborious as a result. The very rings themselves were constructed to be less forgiving, built with less give in order to better support the immense additional weight of the performers. When Hogan decided to try his luck in Hollywood, McMahon's hand-picked successor was the Ultimate Warrior, a man who seemed to be constructed entirely of muscle stacked upon more muscle. It was often joked that he had muscles in places where his wrestling talent was supposed to be. For McMahon, however, that was more than sufficient. The super pose down at the 1989 Royal Rumble, featuring the Ultimate Warrior and Rick Rude, perfectly encapsulated this physique-obsessed culture. It was, for all intents and purposes, a bodybuilding show inserted into a wrestling event. In the meantime, exceptionally skilled, smaller wrestlers found their careers stagnating. Bret Hart was still confined to the Hart Foundation tag team. Shawn Michaels was a member of the Rockers tag team. Owen Hart was losing matches under the guise of the Blue Blazer. And Jake the Snake Roberts seemed permanently stuck in the upper mid-card. The art of technical wrestling simply did not align with the company's entertainment-first approach to its product presentation. This corporate philosophy would remain firmly in place until 1992, the year Bret Hart finally received his big push. That career elevation, however, only occurred because there were no other credible options after Hogan defected to WCW. The box office failure of the movie No Holds Barred should have served as a clear warning about the limitations of the company's appeal to a broader audience. Instead, Vince McMahon chose to double down, prioritizing spectacle even more heavily over substance. The top-level talent being promoted couldn't perform at a high level in the ring, while the genuinely skilled performers were saddled with embarrassing gimmicks like polka dots or rooster costumes. Just take a moment to consider the incredible amount of talent that was either misused or completely underutilized throughout 1989. The Million-Dollar Man, Ted DiBiase, arguably the perfect heel champion, was never given a world title reign. Mr. Perfect was consistently kept in the mid-card, despite being universally recognized as one of the finest in-ring workers on the planet. Ravishing Rick Rude was used as a stepping stone for the Ultimate Warrior, even though he was a vastly more polished and superior overall performer. Owen Hart was hidden under a mask and treated as an enhancement talent. Jake Roberts was trapped in a series of feuds with no real significance. The legendary Dusty Rhodes was subjected to the humiliation of wearing polka dots. Terry Taylor's career was effectively torpedoed by the ridiculous Red Rooster gimmick. The incredibly talented Barry Windham had a brief run in the company that was so unremarkable, most people barely even noticed he was there. Conversely, the wrestlers who received the biggest pushes were Hulk Hogan, who was notorious for refusing to lose to anyone, the Ultimate Warrior, who lacked fundamental wrestling skills, and Zeus, an actor who had never received any formal training whatsoever. On the surface, 1989 seemed to be the company's absolute peak, with WrestleMania V delivering massive pay-per-view numbers, mainstream media attention at an all-time high, and Hulkamania continuing to run wild across the globe. However, beneath the polished exterior, a serious decay had already begun to set in. In just 3 short years, a massive trial would completely take over the news headlines, and the infamous Ring Boy scandal was about to erupt. Consequently, their viewership would completely crater. The organization would be confronted with a challenge to its very existence, one that came dangerously close to shutting its doors for good. And for anyone who was observing events with a keen eye back in 1989, the fractures in the facade were already becoming quite obvious. The celebrated golden age was already fading away, even as the cash continued to pour in without end. The company in 1989 was an entity that had become completely enamored with its own press clippings. They operated under the assumption that Hulkamania was a force that would last indefinitely. They championed the idea that sheer muscle mass was more important than actual wrestling talent. They were convinced they could elevate any performer to superstar status, regardless of their inherent capabilities. It turns out they were profoundly mistaken about every one of those assumptions. So, what was the next chapter in 1990? Be sure to watch our next video to discover what happened. Remember to like and subscribe for 100 years of good fortune. We will catch you next time.